My name is Beandrea July. I'm a film programmer here at the UCLA Film and Television Archive, and I want to welcome you tonight to the Billy Wilder for our screening of Wanda. Yes. And we have an esteemed guest tonight, Elena Gorfinkel, who you may have seen in the lobby selling her wonderful book. After the screening, she will sit for a Q&A with our Archive Research and Study Center Director Maya Montañez Smukler. And so stick around for that. And I'm just going to do a few housekeeping and announcements, and then I'll bring Elena up to formally introduce the film. So tonight's free screening, as well as all of our year-round programming, is made possible by the generosity of an anonymous donor, and we want to thank them and our partners at the Hammer. We also want to thank the UCLA Center for the Study of Women, the Barbara Streisand Center, and also, of course, the archive staff that make all these evenings possible. Let's give all of them a round of applause. And just some house announcements. You can take photos or video before, so now, or after the program, but not during the film. Please silence and put away all of your devices that emit light, because even if you think we can't see it, we definitely can. And if you want to spread the word about your experience tonight, you can tag us at UCLA FTV Archive on your preferred social platform, as well as log the screening on Letterboxd. You can also sign up for our newsletter at cinema.ucla.edu and find out about all the good programs we have coming up. And now I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Elena. Elena is a film scholar, critic, and curator whose recent projects include two major Barbara Loden retrospectives, Wanda and Beyond, at BFI South Bank just this past summer in June, and The World of Barbara Loden at Anthology Film Archives, also this summer, July and August of 2025, which was organized, of course, alongside the release of her book for sale out there and probably afterward, Wanda and Beyond, which just came out. She has delivered keynote and invited lectures internationally, including at the Krakow Lecture at Goethe University in Frankfurt, the Cinepoetics Lecture at Freie Universität Berlin, and has spoken at Yale, Chicago, Cambridge, and Vanderbilt. Her public programs and filmmaker conversations have appeared at BFI, ICA London, Tate Modern, Lux, and Light Industry. She also serves on the editorial boards of Journals of Cinema, Media Studies, Camera Obscura, World Picture, and ASAP Journal. A member of the London Film Critics Circle, she writes for Sight and Sound, CinemaScope, Art Monthly, and Another Gaze, and contributes essays and interviews for Criterion and other distributors. Please welcome Elena Gorfinkel.
I'm really delighted to be here to introduce this extraordinary film, Barbara Loden's Wanda, which was released a little over 55 years ago in August of 1970 at the Venice Film Festival, winning its Passanelli Critics Prize. It's especially moving to be here at the UCLA Film Archive because of the critical role that the archive has played in the restoration and revival of the film, and to be here with members of the audience who were so essential to the film's now legendary restoration and re-release. In particular, the film restorationist Ross Lipman, who spearheaded the film's preservation from rescued original negatives at the archive. And we also have with us Barbara Loden's son, Marco Joachim, who has kept her legacy going and was an immense help to me in so many ways in my writing of the book about the film published with the BFI Film Classics. Yet the path to Wanda's status as a film classic was very long and not immediate or automatic. It took the work of many decades of devotees and advocates to bring it back into the light, among them the archive, as well as many critics, writers, filmmakers, restorationists, and scholars who screened the film, talked about it, and tended to its ongoing life as a cinephile lodestone. Film history, Wanda reminds us, is never written just once. Yet at the heart of all of this is something that At the heart of the film's now mythical and iconic status is the immense talent of actor, writer, director Barbara Loden, whose vision this film was from start to finish. Wanda is now considered a landmark work of American independent cinema, made by Loden on the margins of the US film industry with minimal support and entirely independently of existing production infrastructures. Marguerite Duras called it a miracle, but I would say it is perhaps also a gift from Loden's own imagination. Made over the course of 10 weeks with a 4-person crew on a little over $100,000 from a single patron, the safari entrepreneur Harry Schuster, the film was shot on location in the ruins of a once thriving anthracite mining area in and around Scranton and Carbondale, as well as in Waterbury, Connecticut. Wanda offers a searing critique of the ineluctable fate of an ordinary working-class woman, played by Loden herself, who abandons her life as a miner's wife and mother, choosing instead to drift. Its origins lie in a Sunday news profile that Loden read about an ill-fated bank robbery and the woman accomplice, Alma Malone, who expressed gratitude for her sentence. What kind of woman, Loden wondered, could be that, quote, according to Loden, passive and numb in her assent to imprisonment? Here was the seed that bloomed into the irreducible and inassimilable figure of Wanda Goronsky, played unforgettably by Loden herself in a haunting performance. Unusual for its time for its representation of underclass marginalization and of a woman's plight unseen in US cinema, Loden produces for us a profoundly haunting portrait of an anti-heroine at her limits and on society's margins. Wanda, her creation, refuses neat identification or liberal models of empathy, challenging the film viewer to contend with a figure whose passivity is their primary survival mechanism. The film, as you'll see, veers across melodrama, road film, and heist narrative, and then back around. And in this, Loden subverted many conventions of the cinema, both in terms of representation and also in terms of industrial practices in her approach and production process. In being made on the studio's margins, Wanda is very much a proto-feminist indictment of the sex and gender dimensions of capitalist exploitation and immiseration, but it is also a reproach of a particular industrial mode of film production. Whereas the film is often framed as part of the emergence of the new Hollywood, I would argue that it exists decidedly oppositional to it, allied and inspired in spirit and practice to the traditions of the underground, the avant-garde, and the new American cinema then flourishing, and from which Loden drew inspiration. Unsentimental and deglamorized, Wanda, the character, and Wanda, the figure, was in Loden's own words, an anti-Bonnie and Clyde film. In drawing a bridge between Wanda's strike with no name and her wandering through the film's landscape of calm banks, shopping malls, sweatshops, saloons, and parking lots, we can better situate the radical punch of Loden's singular intervention and her sadly only feature. Loden, who had an acting career in film, television, and theater, made 2 educational shorts after Wanda and struggled in the 70s to secure funding for further features that she was working on from her screenplays before her early death of cancer in 1980. Wanda's exploration of women's unvalued labor and experience of stagnant time was set on the very terrain of what, as you'll see, Loden described as a scene of waste and wasted people. And this very propitious choice of the locations that she shot in really resonated with histories of extraction and the unvalued lives lived in an afflicted America. So I want to end with a couple of quotes, both about this place that the film describes and a particular position that Wanda Goronsky is situated in, as well as Loden's approach to filmmaking. And so Loden stated about the landscape and about the film, and she said, "A lot of people say, who cares about people like this? But this is my whole point. There's a vast wasteland of people floundering around and have no reason for their existence. See, these people aren't aware of their condition. It's the whole thing that's wrong with America, the whole blight of America in one picture." This larger sense of a socialist critique also aligned with her emerging aesthetic vision and another kind of deindustrialized cinematic practice. And I want to end with this quote that often gets cited, but I think it's really a powerful one, where she says, "I really hate slick pictures. They're too perfect to be believable. I don't mean just in the look. I mean in the rhythm and the cutting, the music, everything. The slicker the technique is, the slicker the content becomes, until everything turns into formica, including the people." These words of Loden's, I think, can accompany us into the space of Wanda and resonate with our experience of watching it then as now, as powerful as it was in 1970 as it is in 2025. Thank you.
Distressing in so many ways, but punctuated by humor that feels very natural, but also just the performances and the way the actors, they know their craft, so they can balance drama, violence, sadness, and humor. You've seen this film a million times, of course. What surprises you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I also noticed the humor, but I think, there's always something slightly different each time I watch it, or just in the sense of the rhythm of the film or particular details that kind of come forward. But I guess to your point about the humor, I think perhaps, on a first watch, the poignancy and the sense of the cruelty of like the film, or the sense of the rawness of it, is the first thing that one notices. But I think in terms of the particular investment in performance that Loden brought to the filmmaking, I think it's really clear. One can even trace in terms of her own career. I mean, she started out in the 50s also appearing in small television roles, so that element of like the using physicality towards this friction between these characters that are so finely wrought between her and Michael Higgins as Mr. Dennis. I think that we see this way that really finely wrought friction between them is also something that is bound up in rhythm and contrasting tempos, but also the sense that they're this fundamentally odd couple. So that I think when you watch it over and over, there are like elements of the kind of subtle slapstick come through. I mean, there's this a really interesting critic, Belgian critic, Dirk Lauwert, who talks about this kind of trace, this slight trace of, an element of slapstick that is kind of there in the way that Loden embodies kind of her performance, but also in relationship to Higgins, particularly when they meet. And I tend to laugh just at the way that the performances are sort of timed. I mean, this film has an incredible sense of timing that's both connected to the flow of filmic reality, but also the way that it's punctuated and edited, which is also a credit to Nick Proferis as both cinematographer and editor.
Yes, absolutely. Interesting about slapstick makes me think about the use of props. Of course, the pocketbook, the enormous pocketbook where she keeps saying, "I don't even have anything in this purse," but she still always carries it. She loses it. She's robbed. He goes through it, and then in that final scene, even when she's running away from the man who's attacked her, she's still got that purse. So that attention to detail is throughout the film. Tell us, you've spent so much time on this film and studying Loden's approach and the production history. Tell us a little bit about the production history, where she filmed, her use of actors and non-actors. Give us a sense of how this beautiful film was made.
Sure. Well, I think the process of the making of the film really took close to a decade from the moment of its sort of conception and her carrying around this news story and trying to build a narrative out of it, and from the first script version that she wrote in 1961, which was called The Gray World, to different iterations of the script to the shooting of the film, because she was looking for funding for some time for it, particularly from the mid-50s onwards. And so it took some time to develop. And so what I was interested in the book and also in my research was trying to trace that process, but also the way that the idea of Wanda kind of metabolized and grew and kind of snowballed into what we see on screen. And in terms of Loden's process, I think she initially thought that someone else would direct, and then eventually came to understand that this was something that she needed to make herself. And that presented a number of challenges, certainly in terms of both being the director and the star of the film, but that tension between being in front of the camera and behind the camera, I think, is also what makes it, as someone exclaimed, a masterpiece. In that this kind of sense of both being very attuned to what she wanted to get out of both the location and managing, and also managing this cast of non-professionals was rather significant. And I think it really shows in the film in the sense that she's not only creating this fictional reality, she's also stepping into this almost like documentary scene, and that tension between this documentary space and a fabulated space is what is super interesting in the film. In terms of Loden's production, she spent some time, once she got funding for the film from Harry Schuster, she spent several weeks just location scouting before actually deciding on the locations, and then when shooting began in the summer of 1969. Another thing I find really fascinating about the film is that it was shot in the summer of Woodstock. And so to me, there's a lot of things in my process of research of the production of the film. I was really interested in all the things that were not in the film, or things that got cut away, whether it was through her own kind of process of cutting out things, but also contextual, the moment of the film's making relative to what's in the film. But to come back to the point, I can go on for a long time about this, but to go back to the process of production, the script had a set of scenes and kind of locations that had to shift relative to the locations she found, and some of the contingencies of working with non-professionals. And so I think one of the things that I learned in doing research, and also which was really generously aided and abetted by Marco Joachim's willingness to show me the kind of the documentation of the film as well as the scripts, was that Loden was thinking, was trying to she was both, I would say, like in terms of the script, the dialogue itself was rather scripted, the dialogue between her and Mr. Higgins, but she had to often try to negotiate like the difficulties of non-professionals, of working with non-professionals and coaxing performances from them. And so the film is often talked about as though it's entirely improvised, when in fact it was this really interesting combination of both scripted elements that needed to be accommodated to the conditions of shooting on location with a very, very small crew, and with things that that didn't work, or scenes that she couldn't kind of reproduce from the script. And so there's both an element of the script that's there, but there's also these moments of very ingenious improvisations that happen. And I mean, for example, in one scene that is really at the crux of the film, it's right at the center, it's that really amazing conversation, when they're in the clearing, Mr. Dennis and Wanda have about, her hair, that leads into this whole philosophical excursus about the disagreements between them about wanting anything or not having anything, and who has the right to want and desire, and who doesn't. And she says, "I might as well be dead then." Well, that scene was very much in the script, that dialogue. But then the thing that follows, which was Mr. Dennis chasing the plane, was something that Loden prompted Michael Higgins to to do, because when they were shooting that scene, they were working in this clearing where there were these toy plane enthusiasts that would show up every day. And so Loden asked Higgins, do you want to work with this and try to incorporate this? So this element of this kind of performed play that is a beautiful bookend to this like conversation that they have that is directly from the script is this really extraordinary conjunction of both the scripted and the contingent that I think is really incredible in the film. And it's also really this one place in the film where there's a sense of lightness and play, or a sense of possibility where Mr. Dennis is, Loden herself said, like, I hope that was not too much of a Don Quixote kind of image where he's like chasing windmills. But I think it has this allegorical force, where it's all sky and no deadening ground. And so that's an example of something that I found rather interesting in the production process. But there's a lot more to say about, I interviewed some of the non-professional actors, particularly the husband and Miss Godek, who was Jerome and Marion Thier, who were a couple, and it was their children. So for them, it was a home movie. For them, they recounted their involvement in being directed by Loden. For them, they fondly remember it because their family treats it as a home movie. And so this was something really interesting to me because I knew that scene back to front and had memorized it. But then talking to someone who was was in a film for the first time, Jerome Thier was describing being really overtaken by Barbara Loden's capacity as an actor. With the point at which she moved from being a performer, from being a director, and kind of working, and trying to coax everyone in the courthouse to suddenly, he said a light bulb went on when he saw her just switched into her role, when before she was just sort of, moving around the room and trying to direct everyone. So these kinds of things really opened up for me an understanding of the film, both the kind of material that Marco allowed me to see of Loden's own papers and her documentation of the production, as well as things like interviews with people that hadn't really been talked to.
What kind of sense do you have of how she cast the film, and especially with the folks who are non-actors? Was she doing casting calls as she moved through locations? How much did she rehearse? Of course, at the time that she makes this film, she's an incredibly accomplished actress, both on stage, had already won a Tony Award, and also in films, and is she already working some as an acting coach at this time, or does that come later?
No, that comes later,
But, so she knows how to work with actors, having already been such an accomplished actor. So what kind of understanding do you have of her casting process?
Well, she hired 33 non-professionals from the area of Scranton, Carbondale, and mostly they did calls on the radio. And in interviews, she recounts that often parents would bring their children, whereas, and so there would be these kind of, acres of children that would come that these parents would bring. So then she began to sort of gather the parents that were, and so this was a kind of process that was also connected to the location shooting, but it was mostly through the radio. And I think in some cases, certain actors would get cold feet, or the kind of non-professionals would get cold feet, so she'd have to find someone else. For example, the father of Mr. Dennis in that incredible oniric City of God sequence. Apparently they had someone, and then they had to find someone else. Charles Dosenet, who does, I think he's a really incredible performer, but I think Loden was very aware of the fact that she had to, the thing with non-professionals or kind of amateur actors is that you can't rehearse because they don't have the training to rehearse. It's that she had to just kind of keep the camera running and talk to them as though they were themselves, but give them some guidance about the scene or who they were supposed to be in the scene, but to keep it rolling and then try to get usable footage from that. And so it was really like this process of coaxing and negotiating in shooting the scenes with non-professionals. And some kind of, Jerome Thier, for example, was more familiar with or had perhaps been in like kind of high school theater, and so had a little bit of a sense. But I think many people, he described other people being somewhat nervous, having never really been, in the context of like a movie set of however small scale it was. In other instances, yeah, I think you really see that the kind of editing choices that are made, for example, the guy named Tony, who is not her father, but is just a friend. Just some people think it's her father, but it's in the script, it's just someone, an older man who's Tony.
The coal
He's in the coal bank and he's gathering the coal. I think the way that the scene is cut is because of the fact that she wasn't really able to get good footage of him speaking, and so that often she would get the sound of his kind of good dialogue and then the cut back to her face. But actually it produces this really beautiful sense of reverberation where he's talking about, having a nice day after he picks coal, and we have this sense of her own inner turmoil and the doldrums of this thing that we don't yet know. That we'll see that she's about to go to the courthouse. So there are these really interesting ways that she was able to take the non-professionals on their own terms, but it was particularly, I think she was more familiar with the context and with a kind of working class experience that she was able to really respect that and respect that space. I mean, the courthouse scene is also incredible because you see it's a room full of non-professionals and she's like literally walking into it and has to really modulate to their terms in some ways rather than the other way around, even though she's the one that's kind of directing and shaping this whole fiction.
And she's so quiet in that scene, so she really lets those first-time performers shine. And I mean, of course, that's part of the character of Wanda, but she could have also, as an experienced actor, felt like she had to maybe take up more of the energy just to compensate for performers who were a little more shaky in their inexperience, but she doesn't at all do that. What you had access to her archives, and in your book, which is wonderful, you have many images that we've never seen of the production of Barbara Loden working with her crew. Tell us a little bit about some of those images and what they meant to you in the process of studying this film and her work.
Yeah, thank you to Marco again for allowing kind of his generosity and allowing me to use the images in the book and also to be able to just look at just all of this documentation. And I think I was really happy and delighted to find how much she had documented the production process, and particularly the things that some of the images that are in the book are both kind of documentation of the film being shot, kind of photographs, snapshots of the film being shot, as well as, to me, these incredibly poetic images that to me feel like is something I call in the book like images between the images of her preparatory materials, particularly in costume tests, in which she's sort of testing out particular clothing that she's wearing, and also particular costumes that end up becoming very critical in the film, like her very kind of quasi-bridal, quasi-communion dress, that when she's fully subsumed in Mr. Dennis's image of her, where she kind of is wearing the proper clothing and is like in the fully white costume. And these images for me were really telling, even because they really spoke to Loden's creative process and also the way she was thinking about character, and even things that were left out, like there was I mean, it's not in the book, but there was one set of contact sheets of her trying out different costumes, and there was this kind of like floppy, stripy hat, and she ended up not using it, but it was really interesting to see her sort of figuring out ideas because she was so, this is a character that isn't demonstrative. There's not a lot of psychological exposition, so a lot of the details are really focused on the very kind of materiality of the presence of the character. It was also really interesting to see how the production and location scouting Polaroids to just understand how she was approaching the sense of space and location. And this also gave me more insight into, or piecing together a larger sense of that process, and also kind of where her ideas were and how they transformed to the finished product.
This is such a beloved film. I mean, of course, here at the UCLA Film and Television Archive, Ross Lippman, who's here in the audience. Yes.
Yay.
Beautiful. The film is so beautiful. Has just a wonderful, like truly heroic story about saving the elements and doing the restoration. But as you said in your intro, there have been many scholars, curators, audiences who have, found this film, have championed this film, have celebrated this film. But it's also described as, kind of a lost film, and you reflect on that in the book. And so I always kind of debate that with myself as I'm really interested in, films that maybe didn't get the reception that they, I think they deserved at the time of their release, and so but that they're never entirely lost because maybe there's a print out there or a VHS tape, or the filmmaker, loved that film, maybe even is still around, willing to talk about it. So how do you work with that idea of a lost film that is so beloved, and that, thankfully in 2025 we're here enjoying it again?
I mean, it's been I've thought about this film. I first encountered the film on a very crappy bootleg that I bought off the internet on like a sub-eBay website. And this was the film I used.
When was that, when you bought it?
2005. And I still have it. I managed to recover it. But it was this and it must have been from, there was a VHS and it was either taped from television, or it was from there was a circulating copies of it in the 90s and early. I mean, must have been post MK. It was a French distributor that released it in 2003, I believe. So it might have been from that version. So I'm very interested in the many generations of revivals and the tending to the film, and this tending to the legacy of the film. And I think I'm more cautious about claiming that something is lost. I'm interested in the romance of loss around this film, and particularly around Barbara Loden, because of course, her life was too short, and there were many things that she wanted to accomplish and achieve, and she had many other ideas and projects. And so the film represents that kind of these many layers of loss in a way, and that is, in some sense, produces a kind of mythos, produces a kind of romance. But I wanted to be a little bit more, even though I succumb to that as well, and that's also a way of attending to the injustice of history for women like Loden who had difficulty making work. But I wanted to actually look at also who was tending to this film, because when I first saw the film in 2005, it was because Berenice Raynaud had also wrote this beautiful essay, who I know is an important figure in LA for film culture in LA, recently passed away, and she was one of the first scholars to really redeem the film. And she wrote an essay in 1995, and it was translated into English in 2003. And so there were many generations of kind of feminist writing, kind of cinephiles and kind of critics, and writing about this film, and or like really showing it or trying to keep the flame alive. And I was really interested in being a bit more attentive to all of those voices and all of those efforts, rather than saying like, oh, I'm finding it for the first time. It's not true. It's not. And I think that is also a way of attending to the way that Loden herself was also, she kept it alive during the 70s, because she would travel with the film to women's film festivals. She would, she was someone who was also trying to leave her mark, and so I think that it's much more complicated than just is it a lost film. Of course, I think there's a cinephile pleasure in refinding something or feeling you found it, but it's like we all have that experience. Part of cinephilia is that you you find it and it's yours, and it's like you feel really strongly attached to it. But I think there is also something very particular about Wanda that is this. It's it's our Wanda, in the sense that it's our collective inheritance, but it also stands for many. I think what's so powerful about the film is that, much like Wanda herself, who's a very specific character, but it also refracts many other women's stories, and also refracts onto other women's cinemas made 5 years before Jean Dielman. And I find that really like an incredible thing, dealing with some of the same questions. I think, there's something about coming into a collective understanding of the film's thrall upon us. I wonder if, I don't know if we should open it.
Take some
and also,
questions or comments from
and if
Marco.
people have questions for Ross or for Marco, Barbara Loden's son, I'd be happy to cede the floor.
And it seemed like there were a lot of folks who were seeing it for the first time tonight, which is super wonderful. There's in the back, and if you can wait for the microphone. Oh, sorry, Lauren, are you the only person with the microphone? Oh, okay. Yeah, right here in the almost at the very top. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing your work to the Billy Wilder Theater. I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
Considering the very indie nature of this film, I'm curious, what do you think present-day independent filmmakers can learn from the methodology of how Barbara Loden brought this film to the world? And my second question is, I have never seen the movie before, actually, but I'm struck by parallels that I kind of noticed with Knights of Cabiria. I don't know if you also kind of like, and I'm curious if you think she was a fan of Fellini, or it just happened to be serendipitous that she, that this kind of is similar to Cabiria. Thank you.
So the first question was, remind me again, sorry. I can answer the second. Go to tell me what the first one was again. Oh, right, the lessons for independent. I think a very simple way of saying what the lesson is less is more. To the extent that there's, I think the modesty of scale of the film is actually is like one of the many gifts of the film, is that I don't think Loden was unafraid of, both at the level of content as well as form, she was unafraid of taking something small and magnifying it. And this works at many levels in the film. But I think also, after she made Wanda, she was like, I'd like to make a film on even less than this. But she was very committed to the small scale, and that, I think, allies her much more with much scrappier practices in American cinema in the 60s and early 70s. And with respects to Knights of Cabiria, actually, it's very interesting that you bring that up, because she was a big fan of what I found also rather interesting in the research was I wanted to take seriously every reference she made and to really give tribute to her voice, and also, which is a very acute and very powerful and poetic voice as well, in the way that she described her practice, particularly in the quotes I read in the opening. But she also talked about filmmakers she loved, and I took seriously every single mention, and I followed those through, and that came out in the kind of programs that I did at the BFI and Anthology Film Archives, because I wanted to trace this. But actually, Nights of Cabiria, she did mention Fellini as one of her favorite filmmakers. But Nights of Cabiria is an interesting one because there was a critic who unfavorably compared Wanda to Nights of Cabiria, saying that Wanda, the character, was too stupid, according to him, whereas there was something dignifying about Cabiria, or something more kind of mythical, or somehow more kind of, there's some kind of metaphysics of kind of, or something existential about Cabiria. And I found that actually rather interesting because, they are in many ways very similar characters who are sort of thrust into a kind of drifting mode. And so all of these elements to me are, I think, following the strands was really, really instructive for me in thinking through like what to take seriously, like what she said her influences were, what she said. Any stray reference I would follow. Other questions?
The question about the location,
Mm-hmm.
the city of God,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
the when Mr. Dennis told her that she's not a citizen. Can
Yeah.
you refer something about that dialogue?
The city of God is a separate scene, but the line where she says she's not a citizen of the United States. I mean, I think I've maybe perhaps already said a little bit about it, but it seems to me that there's this contrast between the two characters there, in that Mr. Dennis has an idea of like that you kind of claim the thing you want, and there's this kind of possessive individualism that Mr. Dennis represents. And he's sort of saying like, you're nothing if you don't want anything, right? Like you have to have like a desire for possessions. You have to want to get a hat. And if you don't, you don't exist. Whereas Wanda's character is one who is so ingrained and so kind of anesthetized, in Loden's own terms, by her experience, that she kind of echoes what he's saying, but almost in an ironic light. I find her sort of way of repeating what he's saying as almost like a rebuke, or a, this kind of strange like effect of like in restating it, there's something of an undermining that in just the way that she performs that line, I guess I'm dead then. Like Loden also used this notion of the undead in her talk about waste and wasted people, where she described the character of Wanda as like an undead, and so the sense of someone who is not fully alive, or like the terms through which. And so maybe this is also, hopefully that's helpful. But if you want to know about City of God, it was a real place, and it was it was in Waterbury, Connecticut. I think in Waterbury, Connecticut, and it was actually running well into the 70s or 80s. I actually found some really interesting articles about it. But sorry? Yeah. 84 is when it closed. Yeah, so Holy Land was also, it was kind of created as this sort of reproduction of Bethlehem, and as but amusement park, actually. And so it's a religious amusement park. So it has this very strange status relative to the other spaces in the film, because it's very odd, but it does also kind of, there is a through line in the film that is very much about these glimmers of religion, and the ways that religion is one kind of opiate for working people. And we see that from the beginning, when the grandmother with the rosary beads. So Holy Land, I think it was a very inspired location choice. And where we have Wanda wandering through the actual tour in the catacombs, where we have these crazy like scenes of like sinners being mauled by lions and tigers in these caves, right? And at the same time, Mr. Dennis is sort of being cut down to size by his very concerned and disdaining father. So there's this really interesting work that scene does that moves it much more into something, into a kind of very different zone, and that's that location.
Well, and the timing of Mr. Dennis having that conversation with his dad before his big crime, of course, feels very. It's just very heavy that it's happening in that setting.
And that's like the real job. Like he's going to get a real job, and there's this kind of echoing between, like Wanda and like I'm no good and being a good boy. Like there's a kind of like poetic, rhythmic rhyming of the language. It's very simple language, but it's also very full in these scenes. There's someone right here. Can you wait for the mic? Yeah, I can. There's a mic. You want to grab the mic? I'll repeat it. The film was not in black and white. The film was not in black and white. Did you watch this film? Or
He's asking about the question. Asking about the film's color or black and white, but the film is in color.
The film is in color. The entire film is in color. But you perceived it as being in black and white. Is that what you're saying?
No, it was all in color. Did she?
It was on color, but I will say this, that she initially wanted to make it in black and white, but everyone told her that, or this is what she said in interviews, but that she chose to make it in color because people encouraged her, because that would allow it to be shown on television. But there's a whole other thing that the film did show on television in the 70s and the 80s, which I found also rather interesting in terms of its exhibition and reception, because it was one of these things that kind of challenges the idea of its lostness, because it did actually, people saw it.
I wonder how it was edited for television. I mean, if it was for time and what was taken out.
Yeah, I'm not sure that much was. I mean, but it did show throughout the 70s and 80s. But to the question of, I think earlier prints, and maybe Ross could speak to this, but earlier prints, the initial kind of print run of the film, the color was much more faded and wasn't to Loden's liking. And so when Ross Lipman found the original camera negatives, and he writes about this in this essay called Defogging Wanda, that's on Criterion.com, you can go look it up. What Ross found was that the images were the color was much brighter than what those original release prints were. And so that what some critics described as kind of watching it through a snowstorm, or that was a consequence of these poor release prints that were created in 1970-71, where in fact what we're watching is a much more vibrant color in the restored version. And so the version that I saw on bootleg was likely one of those release prints that was like reproduced a million times through like bootlegging, was even more, maybe approximated more of like a brown and white film or something. I guess we should, wrap it up.
Thank you
Yeah.
so
Thank
much,
you all for
Elena.
coming.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.